This video will not be monetized. Please enjoy. Half Sword is not a game yet. It is a highly realistic peasant simulation where you engage in everyday medieval activities such as high-speed grappling and having your body violently dismembered. This game is very graphic. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. I choose to make this game very graphic. I also choose one of 8 different classes and enter a gladiatorial arena to kill an innocent man. The goal of today's video is to better understand the advanced medieval tactics of Half Sword by defeating 1,000 peasants with each class. So join me on this work-in-progress demo taste test as we slash, bludgeon, strangle, and pelvic thrust our way toward the true meaning of Half Sword. But first, I have to tell you something. Homelessness. It's one of the world's greatest epidemics. In fact, the United Nations estimates that there are over 150 million homeless people currently asking for your change. Now, living on the street, drinking out of puddles, and fighting your fellow man for half-eaten Subway sandwiches isn't nearly as fun as it sounds. And I feel very passionate about solving this terrible crisis, which is why I have been working with the sponsor of today's video, GamerSupps, to develop a foolproof plan to end all homelessness. Every month, GamerSupps sends me several pieces of their high-quality merchandise. The clothing is great, but market research indicates that a grown man can only wear 200 shirts at a time before dying of heat stroke. So what did I do with all of my extra stuff? Quite simple. Over the past 3 months, I have been covertly distributing these highly sexualized items to members of the homeless community. You see, I believe in the idea that things need to get worse before they can get better. Which is why I am actively attempting to increase the collective horniness of the homeless population until it reaches a critical mass, at which point our governments will have no choice but to come up with a solution. Because let me tell you, the only thing worse than being approached by a toothless man named Monkey Fingers is being approached by a toothless man named Monkey Fingers who's all geeked up from his rapidly shortening Shy Lily sweatpants. Try ignoring that, Mr. President. But that's only phase 1 of the plan. Phase 2 is to secretly dose the homeless by lacing their drinking water with delicious GamerSupps energy powder. By combining an endless supply of energy supplements with an inexhaustible font of gooning material, we will have created a very compelling argument for solving homelessness in the next 10 minutes. Listen, homeless accelerationism is a thankless job, but as far as I'm concerned, if you're not out here working a homeless man into a sexual frenzy, then you're actually part of the problem. So join my crusade by clicking the link in the description and purchasing some GamerSupps. You can even use promo code Reggie for 10% off to help you on this noble quest. God willing, we will solve this once and for all. Now, back to the video. The game begins with you choosing one of 3 gore levels. Any choice is perfectly acceptable as long as it's grotesque. Proceeding to the character selection screen, we can observe many different classes, ranging from peasant farmer all the way up to full-body chastity cage. We will start our journey at the bottom, a lowly serf who can't even afford a weapon, but that won't stop us from honing our body into the perfect killing machine. Each battle begins here in the arena. It's one-on-one combat, just us and the AI opponent named Willy. Now, if you want to beat 1,000 Willies with just your bare hands, you're going to need to develop a variety of techniques. Luckily, necessity breeds innovation, which has resulted in Serf combat having some of the most nuanced and creative strategies in the game. By mercilessly butchering 1,000 men, I have identified 5 clear archetypes for the combat Serf. The first and most pervasive among these was the Flailing Maniac. I assume a high guard and slowly approach my enemy. When they're in range, I start throwing left and right hooks, and I don't stop until someone's dead. The primary weakness of this technique is passing out from exhaustion and getting beaten to death on the ground. But if you want to maximize your chances of seeing your family again, I recommend tapping left alt to throw a jab and then start swinging. I do not know why, but this makes your punches land like sledgehammers on the side of poor Willy's head. You'll know you're doing it right if you start making giant impact clouds of dust, blood explosions, or if you hear a big crunching sound when your punches land. I've killed about 100 serfs like this, and I rate it a 4 out of 10. The high volume of this approach can be contrasted with our next archetype, the counterpuncher. This style of fighting is employed primarily by people who watch too much UFC.
I want to oil you up. What the fuck does that mean?
The idea is to raise your left hand and wait for Willy to deploy his Flailing Maniac style. Then, as he's blitzing in, you time a perfect left hook to put him down. Usually, it takes 2 or 3 of these before your opponent will get really dizzy and fall over, at which point I recommend finishing him off by punching him in the ass until he dies. However, I decided to take this to the next level by increasing my mouse sensitivity. This allows me to accelerate my punches faster, which turns them into brain-destroying nuclear missiles. These can easily kill Willy in one hit, and it gets even better if I'm wearing iron gauntlets. Now, the natural enemy of the counter-striker is the grappler, because good luck getting your fade-away knockout when your opponent grabs you by the collar, drags you to the ground, and then spins you around like a dreidel while punching you in the back of the head. Overall, counter-punching is a 7 out of 10. On to the next style, the kicker. At a low level of play, the kicker exists as some kind of goblin degenerate who spends their entire time running away from you and kicking you in the shins until your legs are broken, at which point he will stomp on your head like a territorial bird killing a rattlesnake. This is effective, but if one dares to achieve greatness in this world, they must acquaint themselves with the spin kick of death. By maxing out my sensitivity, it is possible to initiate a kick, do a 360-degree rotation to generate additional force, and plunge my foot deep into Willie's brain. This kills the peasant. This technique takes a while to master, and you will feel like a jackass every time you spin around, hit nothing, and die instantly. But for those willing to persevere, it is a powerful art form. The only known weakness is rotating the wrong way, tripping over your own feet, and caving in the back of your skull when your head hits the ground. I killed about 200 serfs using this technique, and I'm rating it an 8 out of 10. Next fighting style, the grappler. Grapplers are characterized by a total lack of self-preservation instinct. They do not experience basic sensations such as pain or fear. Instead, those emotions have been replaced with an unquenchable thirst to grab your body and execute some bastardized form of judo until they've got you on the ground. And God help you if they get you on the ground. My personal favorite technique for finishing grounded opponents was the centrifuge of death. I simply grab my enemy by his ankles and rapidly rotate in place, swinging him outward like a screaming helicopter blade. I then carefully approach the nearby fence post and test it for durability using the side of my opponent's head. I have also experimented with weaponizing my airborne enemy to some limited success. Now, maybe you can't get your opponent to the ground, which precludes you from going full helicopter. In these instances, I have found that kicking their legs, grabbing them by the collar, sprinting toward the nearest fence post, and smashing their body against it is an acceptable alternative. This is fun, but there's about a 40% chance you knock yourself out in the process, which can lead to some awkward moments. So, tread lightly. In previous versions of the game, the grappler had access to an ultimate maneuver called the death roll. If you grab your opponent by the ass just right,
you can control any man by his asshole.
You could initiate a balls-to-the-wall, high-speed grappling exchange. With the physics engine now broken, whatever happens after this point is up to God. But it usually ends with one or more people crashing into the fence and dying on impact. Unfortunately, this technique isn't available anymore, so I'm going to have to rate grappling a 6 out of 10. By this point, we've killed about 850 peasants through a variety of flailing, counterpunching, kicking, and grappling. So now we can move on to my final and least favorite combat serf technique. The headbutt. More art than science, headbutting is the dangerous gamble of betting that my skull is structurally superior to yours, and then trying to prove it. By sprinting into the enemy at a high speed and adjusting my camera angle at the last second, I am able to cause a cranial collision that might kill them, or it might end my bloodline on the spot. It's almost exactly a 50-50. If you're feeling particularly adventurous, you can even attempt this technique in first person. This is either incredibly satisfying or the most traumatizing experience of your life. There is no in-between. Obviously, headbutting is risky, but through rigorous training and a regiment of skull-thickening exercises, your chance of survival can be improved marginally. Personally, I recommend practicing your headbutts on the training dummy. Try and see how many times you can slam your forehead into it before you forget how to walk. My personal record is 9. That might sound ridiculous, but I'm serious. In fact, after an hour of practice, I became so proficient at giving head that I brought a headbutt to a knife fight, and won. That being said, there are still some weaknesses to this technique, namely short people. It is not uncommon to headbutt a man 2 or 3 times, at which point the part of his brain responsible for motor function has likely been pulverized. Long story short, he can't stand up anymore. Looks silly as hell, but since he's down there, you won't be able to reach him unless you're in the 99th percentile of forehead length. As is, I would rate headbutting a 3 out of 10 for one-on-one fist play. However, I would increase this to a 5 out of 10 in the Spoilin's game mode, because if you're lucky enough to find a plate helmet, your headbutts will slide through the enemy gray matter like butter. Since we're on the topic, I will now speak extensively about Spoilins. Spoilins is an analogy for real life. You and several other people all start off with nothing. However, in the center of the arena are a variety of valuable items, which, with enough ambition and maybe a little sociopathy, can be acquired and used to subjugate your fellow man. Class warfare is an abstract struggle between social castes. However, trying to stand up while I beat you with a hammer is a literal struggle. If you've ever wanted to lay in a pool of your own blood while an illiterate man beats you into a coma, and two peasants desperately struggle over a wooden paddle in the background, then Spoilin might just be for you. All you have to do is determine your faction allegiance based on which weapon you like using. Will you become a hammer enthusiast? Or perhaps join the metal pliers mafia? Some people will tell you the best weapon is the giant candle pole, because it has the most reach, and all of its combos can be performed with 100% accuracy even if you're having a stroke. However, this is big candlestick propaganda, and I'm going to tell you the real truth. Double wooden chair is the real truth. The wooden chair offers the most robust blocking profile, and when swung with enough classism, it will end your opponent on the spot. Just watch as I effortlessly divorce this candlestick peasant from his worthless life. That's right, these streets belong to the chair Yakuza. Honorable mentions also go out to double buckler style, and lastly to those psychopathic peasants who butchered their enemies with a knife and then wielded their dismembered limbs as instruments of violence. Because it's not enough to beat my enemies with weapons, I need to beat my enemies with my enemies. The only thing holding this style back is that chopped off limbs don't appear to have collision physics, which means instead of using the severed leg, you usually have to resort to using the rest of the body, which is very cumbersome. That covers the weapons of Spoilin, but what about the defensive options? A lot of people will try to tell you that the best defense is a good offense. That is wrong. The best defense is a human shield. I've experimented with this extensively and found the optimal approach is to find a willing participant, use a hammer to break both of their arms, then grab them by the face and position yourself behind them. Your screaming and bloody human shield will now confuse the enemy while absorbing most of their attacks. Just remember, breaking the arms is important to prevent your shield from turning around and knocking your brains out with a candelabra, so aim for those elbows. In conclusion, Spoilin, 10 out of 10 class warfare. I have never felt so radicalized. Now, let's move on to the next topic. All of the previous data was gathered by killing 1,000 people at the serf level, but now let's move it up to the peasant tier. Here, we get a mixture of obscure and improvised weapons, such as sickles and pitchforks. I have experimented with each of these options, and I believe in garden hose supremacy. This is the closest you can get to hitting your enemy with a pickaxe, and it is truly gruesome, because with every swing, I'm either smacking a man in the side of the head with my long, hard shaft, or I'm just straight up dismembering them on the spot. But that's not why it's my favorite. It's my favorite because of the versatility. For example, by right-clicking, I can adopt the Grim Reaper stance, and wield this almost like a scythe. New Stardew Valley just dropped, and it's fucking brutal. In fact, I have such faith in my farmer-style combat that I will put it up against any knight in the entire game, and win. Now, combat at the peasant level is also the best place to experiment with throwing weapons. This is a very difficult technique, but if you practice diligently for hours, then you can confidently line up your shot, throw your weapon, miss the target completely, and get killed within 5 seconds. However, on the off chance that you actually do hit your shot, it feels like you just landed on the goddamn moon. Usually, it will take 3 or 4 hits before your opponent forgets how his feet work, at which point you've won. I am also pleased to report that within the throwing weapon style, the garden hoe is again the superior option. This thing spins through the air like a ballerina on crystal meth, and much like crystal meth, it will ruin people's lives. This is your brain on speed. Not even once, kids. Now listen, I understand that you can't always get your hands on a garden hoe, so I would recommend the pitchfork as a suitable alternative. This is one of the few actually effective stabbing weapons in the game. Since no one has armor at this level, everything is a valid target. What I like to do is approach my enemy, jam the pitchfork into them, and then let go, because good luck winning this fist fight against me with a 6-foot pitchfork lodged in your foot. Just be careful, because sometimes this can cause the enemy to spasm in unpredictable and potentially dangerous ways. Final analysis: peasant combat with garden hoe, 9 out of 10, pitchfork, 8 out of 10. I salute my fellow farmers. Now, on to the next class. We just finished with peasants, so we're moving on to tiers 3 and 4, which I am collectively referring to as commoners. This is where we are introduced to our first conventional weapons and some rudimentary forms of armor. After dedicating myself to the destruction of 2,000 commoners, I feel a certain kinship with the federal government, and also I am prepared to tell you my favorite methods of annihilation, starting with the longsword. The longsword is a weapon reserved for people of class, skill, and refined tastes. Once you wield one of these, you will immediately stop respecting everyone else unless they are also wielding a longsword. The hypothetical skill expression of this weapon is very high, because with enough practice, you can employ several real-life parrying and counter-attacking techniques. This is what simply makes us better than everyone else, and especially better than those filthy spear enthusiasts who only know double left click and abuse range advantage. Absolute vermin. My average day as a longsword fetishist includes waking up and stabbing a man in his genitals for the crime of not using my favorite weapon. However, whenever you encounter another longsword connoisseur, it is morally imperative that you engage only in honorable and fair duels, like when I snuck up behind this man and cut his back off. Dear God, the arm is still moving. I must have killed about 500, maybe 600 commoners using the longsword before the spirit of innovation possessed my hand and caused me to press right mouse button. This stance is half sword. By shortening our grip, we can turn our elegant longsword into a close quarters bludgeoning and stabbing weapon. This is best utilized against demons of the night, such as spearmen. And if you're really lucky, you can pull off the executioner's embrace, which is where you loop your arms over the enemy's head and pull back on the longsword, sawing it through their spine like a knife through cold cartilaginous butter. This is most easily done in first-person view. Just watch as I effortlessly process this man into free-range fertilizer. Truly amazing. All in all, the longsword is a 10 out of 10 weapon. Use it, chop off a man's hands, kick him in the chest, and then uninstall the game, because it doesn't get any better than that. The only thing the longsword is objectively weak against is the Peasant à picot. But that's just because everything is weak against the Peasant. This is a filthy and demonic evolution of the spear that is used exclusively by degenerate Satanist pig dogs with no moral compass. Which brings us to my second favorite weapon, the Peasant à picot. This is essentially a spear which has decided one direction of stabbing wasn't enough, so let's try adding 21 more. When I use this weapon, my neurons enter a metabolic hibernation as I require only 5% brain activity to pilot the Peasant at 100% efficiency. It is as easy as it looks. Simply identify the direction of your problem and wave a big spiky stick in that direction until the problem is rolling around in a pool of its own blood. The reason this is effective against the longsword is that it has remarkable range, and the spike placement is so dispersed that even if your enemy closes the gap, you can probably still kill them just by spazzing out and pissing your pants. In fact, I decided to prove this point by winning 100 duels with the Peasant without attacking at all. Earlier in the game, I was dragging around a man's lifeless body when I had the misfortune of stepping on his pitchfork and dying. This was excruciating, but also thought-provoking. If weapons can penetrate even without being actively thrust, then is it possible for me to maximize my sensitivity, step into the middle of the arena, and spin around in a continuous circle while I let my Peasant passively kill everyone in the room? The answer is yes. This weapon is actually so good that turning into John League of Legends is a viable playstyle. Don't get me wrong, I still died a lot, but I think we can all agree, this is ridiculous. Play calm, 9 out of 10 weapon. If you use it,
I'm coming to kill you!
Or in the ring.
No, in real life!
I want to also give an honorable mention to the two-handed battle axe. This weapon sacrifices some of the range of the longsword for an increased ability to explode your enemy's head. Torturing animals is the first sign of an aspiring serial killer, and using the two-handed battle axe is the second. 8 out of 10 weapon. Now, on to the next class. Moving up from the commoner, we reach the Conscript. This is where things start to get serious. The general vibe of this class is more protection. Shields are bigger and more common. You'll also start seeing chest and arm protection. For this reason, bladed weapons become relatively less effective, while big dumb hammers become quite compelling. For example, when I smash your head to pieces with a two-handed mace, your fancy metal hat has now become a fancy metal soup bowl to hold your liquefied brain. So, the two-handed Morningstar was my weapon of choice at this armor level, and I am here to tell you, I have never been more routinely disappointed by something that I want to love. Hitting someone square on the side of the head and watching them slowly crumple to the ground feels amazing. However, this weapon doesn't have the range of the spear, the versatility of the longsword, the brutality of the axe, or the protection of any shielded build. It just has blunt damage go brr. One redeeming quality of the two-handed Morningstar is that it's quite easy to cripple your opponent's hand and disarm them. At at which point you can roleplay as a massage therapist and take your time administering the most painful and radical physical therapy to ever exist. In conclusion, I'm giving this weapon a 5 out of 10. Haters will say it's a skill issue. I will Photoshop them into every picture on Jeffrey Epstein's Wikipedia page. Now on to the next class, the Soldier. This class is well armored, and the consequence of that is that I can get away with doing way more stupid shit. For example, I prototyped a dual tower shield build where I bludgeon my opponents to death with 30-pound chunks of wood. It does not work very well, and my wife has already left me. Instead, focusing on just one tower shield is actually mildly effective. In a group setting, you can back yourself into a corner, crouch, and put your shield up, which makes you invulnerable to 90% of attacks. Then just wait for everyone to tire themselves out, at which point you can spring forth and start passionately tenderizing their brain meat. One-on-one combat with the tower shield comes down to one critical factor. How thick is that guy's helmet? Because if it's one of the shittier brands, I can whip my shield up over his shoulder and smack him in the head until his face starts to resemble a bucket of mashed up blueberries. This can take a while, but if you're in a rush, you can always try sprinting at your enemy and then bringing your shield up at the last second. This is basically a medieval car crash, and it will either steamroll your opponent onto the ground, at which point they will die from embarrassment, or it will fail spectacularly and no one will attend your funeral. In conclusion, I rate the tower shield 100 out of 10. There is no sweeter pleasure than entering team-based combat and watching my allies get ripped apart by a serial killer because his helmet is too thick for me to stop him. On to the next weapon, the Swiss Vulge. If you adopt this weapon, be prepared to experience the shortest duels of your life. All one must do is simply visualize an enemy limb and then lovingly tap it with the Vulge. Congratulations on your successful amputation. If you'd prefer your duels to last longer, you can always just thrust the Vulge outward and wait for your opponent to literally walk face first into it. After a while, it all becomes rather trivial, which is why I recommend the Vulge as a role-playing weapon. At first, I roleplay as the executioner from Skyrim by decapitating you, and then when I've got you on the ground, I take out my machete and become an African warlord who is harvesting your limbs to ward off evil spirits. It might be the jungle cocaine talking, but I'm giving the Vulge a 9 out of 10. Now we can move on to the final class of the game, the Knight. This class is characterized by high-quality full-body suits of armor, which means, for all intents and purposes, your sword is now a bludgeoning weapon, unless you get really lucky and slip it through a crack in my armor, you talentless piece of shit. Given this development, the typical duel lasts about twice as long, and often devolves into a grappling match, until someone gets the upper hand and starts beating on their immobilized opponent, like a starving man desperately trying to open a can of tomato soup. With that being said, I found that all of the weapons are actually fairly balanced, so I've created a flowchart to help you decide which one may suit you best. Personally, I'm quite fond of the double blunt tier 3 polehammer. My opponent impotently clangs their sword against my armor and calls me a cuckold. In response, I demolish his entire cervical spine. This was an emotionally fulfilling experience. However, the polearm rabbit hole goes so much deeper, because it turns out that there are over a dozen subtle variations of this design, with each one having noticeably different movement properties. The double blunt polehammer with spike is a Korean man screaming at the top of his lungs, while the half blunt poleaxe no spike is 3 Japanese men assembled into a human pyramid. They might look the same to you, but that's just because you're a polearm racist. Now let me put you on some game. There's nothing wrong with just flailing this thing around and scrambling your enemy's brains. But if you're willing to dedicate yourself to researching motion graphics, frame-by-frame footage analysis, and an introductory physics course, you can turn your polehammer into a mobile piece of art. For example, observe this average Australian as he channels 124 years of colonial violence into the side of Willie's head. Truly remarkable. By studying these techniques, I was able to learn 3 essential attack patterns for the polehammer. First, the rangefinder. I simply swing my hammer horizontally, and at the peak of its arc, I swap hands. This sweeps across the enemy and helps us gauge distance. Against unarmored opponents, it may also rip open their stomach. I am not a doctor, but I believe this to be very dangerous. Let's use this maneuver to test our range against an unwilling volunteer. I can confirm he is in range. Next technique, the upward redirect. We start with the hammer behind us on our open side, swing it across our body, and swap stances immediately. This will redirect our hammer to swing from the left while maintaining the momentum from our original attack. This typically results in us violently remodeling our opponent's skull or sweeping their leg out from under them. Both are perfectly acceptable. The final move is the overhead transition. Hammer forward, lift it up while staying parallel to the ground. Then stance swap and follow the momentum through to enact violence upon your enemies. If you have a sufficient abundance of chromosomes, you may be able to execute this maneuver very quickly. However, for the rest of us, we are relegated to polehammer mediocrity. Polearm weakness number 1, mental fatigue. The time to kill at this armor level can be quite excessive. I've spent over 10 minutes emulsifying this man's brain, but that's not stopping him from getting up, flailing at the air, and generally wasting my time. Weakness number 2, desperation grapplers. Anytime you're using a polearm and winning, your opponent will inevitably turn into a panic grappler. For example, in this case, my opponent was losing terribly, so they initiated Operation Wet Blanket by throwing themselves on top of me and pulling me to the ground. The combined weight of 2 sets of armor makes it impossible for me to stand back up, so I'm just stuck on the ground making uncomfortable eye contact while they beg for their life. Honestly, I'd prefer being stabbed. Example 2. In a free-for-all, this man grabbed onto my arm and refused to let go no matter how many times I persuasively punched him in the back of the head. Eventually, I had to just accept his presence and kill the final enemy while he was parasitically attached to me. After a brief sword fight, I was able to escape his grip only by thoroughly and completely caving in his torso. In conclusion, polehammer 9 out of 10, grapplers 0 out of 10. Hoist Gracie should be arrested. The Knight class also has access to a new game mode, Brave Stand. In Brave Stand, we become a raid boss fighting against 4 less armored opponents, as we use every tool at our disposal to pacify this peasant uprising. When you realize how satisfying this is, you will immediately understand why there will never be world peace. Perhaps my favorite part of this game mode is the unofficial minigame, which happens if you've incapacitated each enemy but still haven't gotten the victory screen yet. Now we have to roam around the arena beating half-dead bodies with a hammer until I find which of these 4 men still has the will to live. Turns out, it was this guy. Now, killing a poorly armed militia is a lot of fun, but why stop there? Download a mod that allows you to load in as a tier 8 knight versus a naked man, and teach him a goddamn lesson. There may be a temptation to feel guilty while sawing your way through his ribcage, but remember, we're curing this man of a dangerous affliction known as poverty, and that is a noble deed, so carry on. Final thoughts, Brave Stand, best game mode out of 10. The peasantry must be subjugated. This is where I was going to end the video, but very recently I have uncovered the most ultimate and entertaining fighting style in all of Half-Sword, and I could not resist adding it to the video. This legendary martial art is called hacking. By downloading the Half-Sword Trainer mod, you can effectively become God. For example, we gain the ability to spawn items out of thin air. This immediately opens up new playstyles, such as dual-wielding longswords or triple-wielding tower shields to become some kind of violent armadillo. More experimental options include playing as the Conjurer. Rather than wielding these weapons myself, I can spawn them in as environmental hazards to terrorize my enemies with. Just watch as I spawn in 50 plankons and force Willy to walk through them like a hotbed of coal. Mind over matter, pal. The only weakness of the Conjurer is his own frame rate, because nothing can or will make me surrender faster than 16 frames per second. Now, all of this gets really interesting when you realize you can alter the scale of each object. For example, I can spawn in a stool, or I can spawn in the god of stools. This is a great way to gain a slight edge in Spoilins. Oh yeah, everybody gangsta until Mega Scissors come out. Just make sure you scale the objects across all 3 dimensions, otherwise you'll end up with such lovely inventions as a 2-dimensional sickle. We can also make the weapons smaller. For example, this man is trying to kill me with a microscopic sickle, which is marginally less effective than my macroscopic sickle. Once you become a high-level conjurer, you can even execute maneuvers such as forcefully spawning in a bundle of giant knives into your enemy's arms and watching as they have a panic attack and die. Still working on a more concise name for that one. Now, I feel obligated to warn you about the dangers of mega weapons. It's very fun to duel with mega weapons, but when you attempt to pick one up, there's a 33% chance it doesn't work, a 33% chance it shrinks back to size, and a 32% chance the physics engine violently throws you against the guardrail, killing you on impact. So please, exercise caution with these unholy weapons. Oh, that last one 1%? Yeah, there's a 1% chance you can ride the weapon like a flying broomstick. Now, in case being a medieval wizard wasn't satisfying enough for you, you can always answer your true calling, Deranged Gunman, because this mod allows for any weapon in the game to be fired as a projectile. Personally, I'm a huge fan of the shields, but stools are also a perfectly acceptable option. Once you get really good, you can even practice your trick shots by ricocheting your projectiles off the floor or walls. And when you master that, just cut out the middleman altogether and become the projectile. Now, I don't know about you, but I always thought it was a great tragedy that medieval peasants went extinct before we had the opportunity to crush them with skyscrapers. But by carefully scaling our projectiles, we don't have to fantasize any longer. When afforded ultimate freedom and unlimited power, one cannot resist but to create the most nightmarish hellscapes imaginable, to maximize the suffering upon their fellow man without any clear justification. Truly, this is a stunning indictment upon us all. So I'm rating hacking a 7 out of 10. I am terrified by the fruit of my own mind. Well, that concludes today's video. We have destroyed at least 10,000 peasants on our journey to half-sword mastery, and I'm pleased to announce that despite all of that, there's still so much left to learn. From unarmed combat to high-level swordplay, this game and its community are very promising, and I highly recommend it. Thank you to this month's patrons for supporting the channel, and finally, thank you for watching.